Hello.
Can you
Now
hear
it
me
looks
now?
like you're connected to audio.
Wait, now I can't hear you.
You can't hear me? Can you hear me now?
Can you nod if you can hear me?
I can hear you.
It's so weird. It says it's connected, but I can't hear you at all. I'm going to take my head, see if I can connect without my headset for some reason.
Well, students, we need to have someone take this light. It's right to control. Should we bring it over to the lab?
They're like, yeah, why not?
I mean, yes,
Supported.
we did travel nuts in the. You want more of it? I already have
Can you hear me?
pretty much.
I can't hear you. Okay. She doesn't have the microphone icon.
But she hasn't joined computer audio.
She did join computer audio. And you don't have on the bottom left of your screen, there's the little microphone button that says mute underneath. You don't have that.
I would have her.
Why don't you try leaving and joining again and see if that might reset?
And then when you first join, you'll have a pop-up that says join computer audio. Just make sure you click that.
I think so.
Hear that, Liz?
Can you hear me, Liz? Okay, why don't you try leaving and then rejoining and seeing if that fixes the audio issues? Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, you're back. It's not mine.
It's in it.
That's yours, right? Is that yours? That one's mine.
I can't hear you.
Is that any better?
Yes, I can hear you now.
All right. Well, sorry, I can't put it on my headset. I don't know what's going on, why it's not working. So I'll just have to talk through the computer audio.
Okay, that sounds good.
Yeah.
So I am going to make you co-host,
Okay.
and I will open this up in just a second once we're done chatting, and I'll play the video just sort of saying welcome from Denver Startup Week, that whole fun thing. Once that video ends, it goes straight over to you.
Okay.
And then you just take it from there. And
Great.
when you are done, you just click the end button at the bottom and that'll end the session.
Excellent. Hey, quick question. In terms of people from the audience having questions, do you guys have a preference there? How do those come in if they do? Or
So if they respond, they'll either do it through the chat box or through the Q&A box. Both are available on the screen on the bottom. So you'll just have to monitor that, and you can let them know, saying like, you know, I'll periodically check, or I'll be continuously checking, whatever works best for you and your preferences. Let them know, and that you'll respond accordingly. Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you. And sorry about that.
Oh, no worries over here. Any other questions for me before we get started?
No, that's it, I think.
All right. So I'm going to open things up and have fun.
Thank you.
Welcome to Denver Startup Week. I'm Ben Data, co-chair of DSW. This year marks the 10-year anniversary of Denver Startup Week. This community has been the catalyst for lots of change over the past decade, and this week we're coming together to celebrate the past and dream big for the future. We are able to bring Denver Startup Week to this community thanks to our 2021 sponsors. Thank you to our HQ and title sponsor, Amazon, and our title sponsors, whose leadership makes this week come to life. Capital One Cafe, Downtown Denver Partnership, Fluid Truck, Hotel Engine, and WeWork. And our track sponsors, who have made all of the great content you're hearing today possible. Founder Track, Kickstart, Growth Track, Friday Health Plans, Developer Track, Quizlet, Product Track, Palantir, Designer Track, Battery 621 in the Public Works, People Track, Exactly, and Spotlight event sponsor, Strat Labs. Our headline event sponsors are bringing the excitement this week. Thank you to B-Side Fun, Colorado Public Radio, Comcast, Coors Brewing Company, Denver Pavilions, Entrepreneurship at the University of Denver, Gusto, JP Morgan Chase, Method, Moss Adams, Pine Insurance, Promontory Mortgage Path, Red Bull Basement, Southwest, Tattered Cover, and VF Venture Foundry. Finally, thank you to our partner and member sponsors listed on the screen. Please say thank you to these companies as you enjoy our hybrid Denver Startup Week. And don't forget to use hashtag Den Startup Week to share your experience and moments of inspiration on social media. Have a great week.
Early risers, all-nighters, slow pours, fast crams, post-nap, on the mat, in the stacks, phone down, volume up, complete silence. You ups? Coffee cups, pizza crusts, first semester, fourth quarter. Focus 100, privacy 0. Pre-test, one last check, let's go. However you study, Quizlet takes the guesswork out of your coursework. Learn it, own it, Quizlet.
Hello everyone, welcome to Denver Startup Week. I'm Connor Swanson, the Developer Track Co-Chair along with Aaron Clark, and member of the Denver Startup Week Organizing Committee. Thank you for joining us for the 10th anniversary of Denver Startup Week. At Denver Startup Week, we strive to make all of our sessions a space where attendees can connect, learn, and grow, regardless of age, gender identity, gender expression, race, ability, or sexual orientation. A special thank you to all of our sponsors for their support in helping us to keep DSW free and accessible for all. Thank you for joining us, and have a great week.
Hi, and welcome, and thanks for taking the time on this Friday afternoon to come listen and learn a little bit about this topic today. I'm Liz Harding. I am a shareholder in Paulsonelli's Denver office, and I specialize in privacy and data security. I'm going to pull my slide deck onto the screen now. If you have questions or comments or want to engage on this, please either feel free to throw those up on the chat or on the Q&A. I'll pause every now and then to take a look at those and see if we can make this as interactive as possible. So give me 1 second, and I'm going to share this screen and pull up these slides, and I promise that they're not going to be lengthy or really dull slides. So let's see if I am doing this right. Okay. Can folks see my shared screen? To share this. I'm sorry, I'm going to embarrass myself now with okay. This is sad, but all right, so sorry about that. I think this is now being shared. All right, so I'm going to talk about how not to make privacy a big deal in the diligence field. So I see a lot of issues come up in M&A diligence with respect to privacy. And a lot of them are avoidable, and a lot of them, frankly, can be looked at and kind of figured out really in a fairly non-expensive way. I thought it'd be useful to give you a quick run through, kind of where we are now. I don't want to get into talking about lots of pieces of legislation. I don't want to get into talking about, too many acronyms or anything like that. But I just thought it would be helpful to take a look at kind of where we are now. So, back in the 2000s, and my kids are going to laugh when I tell them this, that it makes me feel really old. But back in the 2000s, when I first started practicing law, computers and the internet were really becoming prevalent in the workplace, and to a certain extent in residential homes. Back then, nobody cared about privacy. People say that there were privacy regulations back then, but when it came to M&A and corporate law, nobody really cared. Fast forward a little bit to the 2010, the boom of social media platforms and video sharing platforms. And there was more interest, but again, honestly, we were doing deals where privacy issues were not really a concern. You might look at IP and whether trademarks were registered, whether there was any potential for IP infringement, but there really wasn't a concern about data, and either data as an asset or data as a liability. Fast forward again, the nice period between kind of 2015 and now, and data has become a huge issue. Data sharing between consumers and businesses, business to business sharing, and business to third-party service provider sharing. Again, late 1990s, nobody cared. We had EU privacy laws, but they were disjointed and they really lacked teeth. Everybody outside of the US thought that the US was just simply the Wild West when it came to privacy. Nobody was really doing anything. Fast forward now, and I promise this is the last time I'm going to use any of these acronyms, but we have an entire alphabet soup of acronyms when it comes to privacy laws. We've got stuff going on in Europe with the GDPR, we've got California, you've got HIPAA for healthcare, you've got GLBA for fintech and financial services and insurance, you've got New York's DFS for fintech and insurance. We've got privacy laws in Colorado now, privacy laws in Virginia, and then privacy laws that impact anybody who processes credit card information. So it's a whole hodgepodge of compliance. So, so what? Why do we care about this? Well, and I'm going to talk about the kind of the risk, perceived risk versus actual risk of these issues in a minute. But just throwing a few items up and together, we got fines and negative PR. Nobody wants to get fined. If I was to ask the question, first off, who knows what the GDPR is in Europe, and what's the thing that concerns people most? It's probably going to be the issue of fines there. You've got the hard costs associated with any sort of breach. The cost of investigating unauthorized access to data, the costs of mitigating that risk, and the cost of making notifications to individuals or regulators if you have to. It can get expensive. Customers care. I think just throwing a couple of stats up, 84% of consumers want more control over how their data is used. And 81% say that potential risks of data collection outweigh benefits. Issues like Cambridge Analytica and Facebook's use of data, I think, have propelled consumer concerns about privacy way more than we've seen in previous years. Investors care. Investors want to see companies that are not bringing with them a huge amount of risk, and that are not bringing with them assets that are not capable of being commercialized. Same with purchasers. Investors and purchasers will often see data as an asset. They want to look at consumer confidence in the product to make sure that they're buying something or investing in something that's going to have some legs. And then purchasers and investors also care because, as we're starting to see, a robust privacy program can give actually a marketing advantage to companies. So I thought it'd be useful to take a look at some, before I started on this, to take a look at some reps and warranties that I often see in purchase agreements or investment agreements, funding round documents. And really, we kind of see those broken down into two sets of clauses. One is that personal information is processed in accordance with applicable law. It's really easy to jump into, just ticking that box and saying, yes, that's exactly, what's going on here. But it's worth breaking that down and thinking what that actually means. And the first thing to really think about on that is, well, what is personal information? The kind of lawyerly definition is really anything from which an individual can be identified, but that's really broad. Under some of our US state laws, personal information is, it's obviously name, email address, bank account number, credit card information, but it can also be IP address or device ID, the geographic location, if it's combined with some other information. So having that understanding of what personal information actually is becomes important to help understand what your investor or purchaser might be concerned about. This rep and warranty also looks at what laws apply. You can't say yes to this without understanding what are you subject to. And then, do you say what you do, and do you do what you say? Do you have a robust privacy notice that tells your customers or people who use your services exactly what you do with the data? And then do you go beyond that? Oh, sorry, I'm just seeing what. I don't see the slides. Can you see the slides now? I apologize. I'm not sure why those slides are not showing up. Let me go back to sharing my screen. No change there, I take it. Let me try. Hang on 1 second. Any better? There we go. Sorry about that. 1 second. Flip through. Right. Sorry about that, everybody. All right. So. Why is all this important to investors and buyers? There's a question, sorry, just come up. Is there a way we can download the slides? I'll figure that out with the Denver Startup Week folks on how we can get those to you. But yes, we'll make sure that they are available. Okay, so why is this important to investors, and why are they digging into this more and more? Well, we just talked in the slide a couple back about fines and reputational risks. Nobody wants to get fined. Consumer confidence. If data is an asset or you're a consumer-facing brand, having consumer confidence that you're going to look after that data appropriately becomes a big deal to an investor or a purchaser. And it becomes particularly so for companies where data is actually an asset that's being purchased. If you're an organization that is developing a significant data set, whether it's in raw data or whether it's in data that is used for, say, machine learning, your investors are going to want to make sure that they have an ongoing right to use that data and information. The other wrap and warranty that I see a lot is that there's no unauthorized access to systems or personal information. So what does that mean? Generally, that means, have you been subject to any sort of ransomware attack, any sort of malware or phishing attack, or any sort of lost laptop? This one is worth spending time on if you see it in your diligence documents, and it's worth asking before you even get close to an investment or an event. And that's because it's one that's easy to say no to without realizing that actually there has been an issue. And I'll give you a little anecdote. I worked with a client that had sold their business and had said no to this wrap and warranty. Hadn't really thought about it. It was kind of embedded in the purchase agreement. Said no to this wrap and warranty, and then just after they closed the deal, the buyer was itself subject to a ransomware attack. And a ransomware attack, for folks that don't know, very simply is you get a threat actor, a bad actor, essentially inserting a piece of malware onto your system that causes the whole thing to shut down and essentially be held ransom until you pay a certain amount, generally of Bitcoin, to get your system up and running again. So the buyer in this case itself was the subject of a ransomware attack and turned around to the seller and said, well, in the course of investigating this, we found out that you yourselves had been subject to a breach a couple of years ago, and you didn't tell us about that. And so we're going to hold you responsible for what's just happened to us, and try to claim back on the indemnity in the sale agreement. Now, it all ended up well because we were able to push that off, and ultimately the buyer was not able to show any link between what had happened to them and what had happened 2 years earlier to the seller. But it would have been something that was avoided if the seller had disclosed their own security incident. So it's worth, it's worth thinking about that in advance of any sort of event. There's a question about the source for statistics on this slide. I'll share that on the slide when we post them. But 43% of cyber attacks are aimed at small businesses. That statistic does not surprise me. Cyber attacks there's a lot more sophistication starting to come into play with larger organizations in terms of investment into security, etc. And small businesses, quite frankly, are that's in some ways an easy target. Often because there either isn't a lot of investment into high level security, or frankly, people are busy running around getting on with their day-to-day jobs, and it's easy to click on that link in the email that causes a phishing attack, or allow some other way of getting that, generally that malware into place. The average cost of a cyber attack, and this is the average cost, so don't panic too much, but it's not insignificant. Dealing with a cyber attack without insurance, which includes having to run forensics to understand what happened and whose data is being compromised, liaising with state attorney generals, liaising with public relations companies, if that's necessary, notifying individuals, providing credit reporting, credit monitoring, that can be expensive. Again, these are things that you as a business want to be thinking about, but they're definitely things that investors and buyers really care about. So I think it's worth just pausing for a second to say that not all companies are the same when it comes to privacy and what investors and buyers are going to be thinking about. And I know that sounds obvious, but a lot of this really does depend on the type of business that you're operating. If you're operating in a regulated industry, so if your site is targeted at kids, or if you're in the financial services, insurance, or health industries, those are heavily regulated industries and are going to attract a lot more scrutiny and diligence than, say, if you're a business-to-business organization that's really not doing very much with personal information. The other area where there is more scrutiny is if you're using or collecting or storing sensitive information. So credit card information about health and wellness, HR or employee information. And then the other areas are where are you doing business? We see increased diligence requests for companies that are either physically located or have a significant sales presence in California, Colorado, and Virginia. That's because those three states have comprehensive privacy laws. Europe and the UK, if you're a business that's operating there, or if you're a US business and your investor or the buyer for your business is based there, we will see a lot of diligence happening in those areas. I've seen deals where the buyer in a couple of cases wouldn't proceed with any other diligence until they'd gotten the privacy diligence sorted out. They were concerned that what they were buying was going to cause them to be subject to some liability. And I've thrown in Brazil as an example that, it used to be that really we talked about Europe and then a few states in the US and regulated industries, but we're starting to see broader privacy laws elsewhere in the world now. So Brazil as an example, China just brought in its own new privacy law. We've got privacy regulations in Australia, Indonesia, Canada. So it's really worth thinking about where you're doing business. And if you're in a higher risk area, expecting some more scrutiny from those investors or buyers. All right, so I want to make sure that we're being as practical as possible here in terms of what to think about. But before I do that, I want to just talk a little bit about fines as well and regulatory actions, and just go. Actually, I'm going to go back. So most companies are not going to get into trouble with regulators unless either they suffer a breach or they do something bad with data or something that they've told people they're going to do one thing with it and they start using it for another purpose and somebody makes a complaint. So it's either you have a breach or somebody makes a complaint. That's when the regulators are generally going to get involved. 9 times out of 10, regulators, both here and in elsewhere in Europe, for example, they're not auditing companies. They're not going out and knocking on doors to say, hey, show us your privacy compliance. So I think it's important to take the risk of fines with a little bit of a pinch of salt. Most companies run into privacy issues in their general day-to-day, either through diligence requests from their customers or diligence requests from their investors or buyers. It's the same issues that get raised. Are you doing what you say you do with the data? Are you keeping it secure? Are you misusing it in any way? Are you complying with your legal obligations? But it's not going to come from the regulators unless something goes wrong. Now, of course, if something does go wrong, then it can be a mess. But when I talk about privacy risk, I if I talk about privacy risk in the context of getting fined or being the subject of an audit, rightly so, a lot of times people sort of switch off. But that's what your investors are concerned about. They're concerned about taking on risk and liability in something that they don't know about. All right, so in terms of what to think about and where to start, there's some low-hanging fruit to get ready for either a sale or an investment. Or, when I'm talking here, I'm also thinking about customer diligence, because if you're in negotiations with your first big customer and you're an organization that is processing data, your customer is likely to have some diligence questions for you as well. So what's the low-hanging fruit? First of all, know your data. What type of personal information are you collecting and using? What do you use it for? What do you tell people that you use it for? Hopefully those two things are the same. Who do you share it with? Do you share it with third parties, either for their own purposes, so they can, say, use it for marketing, or do you share it for with your vendors? Maybe your hosting company or your IT company is able to access it when they're looking on your systems for support. Know what laws apply to your industry. Again, you don't have to become a privacy expert, but at least understand a little bit about what industry are you operating in, and are there any specific laws that are going to apply there. So, an example being, if you're providing services to a hospital, then you're likely going to be a business associate and you're going to be subject to HIPAA. If you're entering into the insurance market, you're probably going to be subject to a number of state insurance cybersecurity regulations and be subject to other regulations such as GLBA, Ram Leaf Flying Act. None of these are overly onerous to comply with, but understanding what applies is important there. Knowing who accesses your data is also really important, and that's important from a couple of perspectives. Your investor or buyer is going to want to know, do you have agreements with those vendors? Have you done any diligence on them? Is your vendor going to have a breach or misuse the data that's going to cause problems for you? And then fixing what you can. The low-hanging fruit really is going to be privacy notices. Make sure that privacy notice is up to date, accurately reflects what you're doing with the data and what you're collecting there. And then vendor agreements. Know your vendors, know who you're dealing with, and ask the question, are they going to properly protect your data? And there's a question here about how do businesses deal with that low-hanging fruit. So you can go out and spend as a business, an inordinate amount of money on a privacy compliance plan. But the reality is most startup companies and small companies, that's not where you need your resources to go. So I think picking off these items that, if they're not in place, are either going to draw attention to you from either a regulator or customers. So there's privacy notices and vendor agreements. There's a question as well about what are the key questions to ask of your vendors, and that's a really good question. When I'm looking at a vendor agreement for a client, I want to see, do they have any sort of data processing agreement as part of their terms of use? It's usually a sort of schedule to their terms of use that tells you, that they're going to protect the data, that they're going to tell you if there's a breach, that they're going to help you if you get a request from a consumer to access their data, and that they are going to appropriately put in place security for your data. Some privacy laws require specific information to be included in a vendor agreement. So it's worth asking your vendors, does your agreement cover what it needs to under CCPA for California, under GDPR, if the data that they're using on your behalf is subject to those regulations. And if it's helpful, when we publish these slides, I can include in the notes some additional questions that I might ask a vendor. Depending on what the vendor's doing and the type of data, I might ask, well, do you have any security certifications, such as ISO 27001? I probably ask that question if they're, for some reason, hosting or using credit card information or healthcare data. If all they're doing is storing business contact email, I'm less concerned about that because that's really not particularly high risk data. So I think understanding what it is that the vendor actually does, and this is easier in some ways to do when you're a smaller company with fewer people involved in that vendor relationship. It becomes a little more tricky when you're a larger organization, or if you've got lawyers involved who are working on those agreements. But again, coming back and making sure everybody who's involved in that relationship with the vendor at least has a basic understanding of what they do, so you can understand how important privacy and security might be in that relationship. I want to make sure to leave plenty of time here. The main takeaways I would give here are to not make your diligence call or meeting the first time you think about privacy and security. I think there are ways that startups and smaller companies can put in place a robust privacy compliance program without breaking the bank. But leaving it until the last minute is not the way to do that. That becomes really expensive. Progress, not perfection. It doesn't have to be a world-class privacy program. If let's say Google is investing in you, it's probably a bad example, but your privacy and compliance program doesn't have to match Google's or your investors, but it needs to pass that sniff test, which is, does it demonstrate that you recognize and understand that you are subject to these privacy laws? Are you able to demonstrate that you've put in the basic consumer-facing parts of that program, like privacy notices? Does it demonstrate that you know what your vendors are doing with your data? There's a question: do I recommend any technical control approach, like implementing any of the CIS controls? Yes, definitely. Again, depending on what the data that you're working with is. What you're going to want to do internally and ask your vendors to do if you're dealing with particularly sensitive data, as opposed to business contact data on the other end of that spectrum, is very different. So understanding, what do you do and what that data is becomes important. And then, I see lots of clients who are fairly far along in either their development of their business or, to be honest, in their relationships with investors and buyers. And it's not unusual to see clients, despite that first bullet, it's not unusual to see clients that, really haven't done very much. And that's okay. There's zero judgment. And there should be zero judgment from your lawyers. The only people who should be making judgment calls on that are your investors, and hopefully this doesn't happen, but a regulator. It's better to start and to get going on thinking about this, whatever stage of company you're at. And as I say, it's easier to deal with this, before it becomes a problem, rather than waiting. There's a question here about recommendations for cookie banners, and that's a really good one, and that's one where actually to go back to where are you doing business. This is actually a really good example of how important it is. So here in the US, you've probably seen, I feel like every site I open up now has a cookie banner that pops up asking if I accept cookies or not. The reason for that is that under some of the state privacy laws, such as CCPA, information that is collected via cookies and enabling third-party cookies in particular on sites is considered likely a sale of personal information. And depending on the age of the user, in some cases consent is needed for that sale. And in some cases, you have to allow people to opt out of that sale. So when you see that cookie banner, that's saying to you, are you okay with us, enabling these cookies? And if you click on the Manage My Preferences, you can go in and toggle the preferences for most cookies to off, certainly third-party cookies. And that's enabling those companies to deal with their requirements to allow an opt-out of the sale of personal information. So remember, personal information includes device ID, IP address, etc. Now that's for the US. So an opt-out approach in the US is fine for now. That's likely going to change in some states in the not too distant future, but for now that's okay. But if you go to Europe or the UK, then it's a different story. The regulators in Europe and the UK have said that to enable cookies, all the essential cookies, which are considered transactional cookies on the site, you need consent and you need opt-in consent. And so if you were sitting in Europe or the UK and you accessed a site, what you would see is a very similar cookie banner pop up. But if you went to manage your preferences, the cookie preferences would all be toggled to off, with the exception of essential cookies. And you would, those cookie preferences could only be enabled for, say, third-party advertising cookies if the user actually toggles them to on. And there have been a number of companies fined in Europe for having that the other way around, for essentially having the default as an opt-out as opposed to an opt-in. So again, that I think is a really important example of where understanding where you do business becomes crucial for understanding, what you might need to do at a practical level for your cookie banner. And there are services out there that can help with that can help to ascertain whether a user is, or whether an IP address is, in a particular geographic area, and help you to set, if you need to set that those cookie preferences one way or the other, depending on what what geographic region you're in. So just to wrap up and say, I do want to make sure there's time if anybody has any additional questions. But just to wrap up, I recently worked on a deal where we kind of came in late to look at the privacy reps and warranties, and it became clear not just to us acting for the seller, but to the buyer of the company as well, that the target company had not done a great deal in terms of understanding what their privacy obligations looked like. And so that caused a couple of problems for the target company. One, it meant that, we had to go in and remediate some of those issues on a really tight time frame. And that was driven by the buyer. But it also caused the buyer quite a lot of concern, and resulted in the buyer changing the structure of the deal to include a fairly significant holdback and indemnity for any privacy violations kind of prior to the closing date. So it does make a difference. And as I say, I think there are ways of doing this so that it doesn't break the bank, and so that you can take a risk-based approach and get that low-hanging fruit items in place, so that when it comes to dealing with diligence for your buyer or your investor, you can answer those questions very easily, and you're not having to make any sort of disclosures around your privacy in the disclosure schedule. Or if you are, it might be, yes, we were the subject of a malware attack. We investigated it and determined that there was no unauthorized access to data, or we investigated it and determined that there was unauthorized access to data, but we complied with our obligations under applicable law in terms of how we dealt with that. So any other questions that I can answer right now? All right, going once. Well, thank you for your time, and enjoy the rest of your Friday afternoon, Friday evening. And please let me know if you've got any questions after this, and I'll make sure to include those couple of items in the notes on the slides, and then circle back with the Denver Startup Week folks to make sure these are made available to you.